Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Steven. For everyone out there listening who might not know who you are, they're missing out. But can you explain yourself a little bit to everybody?
Hi, everybody. My name is Steve Daunt. I'm a professor of oceanography at the University of Rhode Island. I study a lot of different things. The thing I love about oceanography is I can pretty much do whatever I want as long as I can find funding for it. But what I'm best known for is studying life beneath the seafloor.
Okay, what interests you about life below the seafloor? Is the fact that we only know a small percentage of it, or is all of it discovered? I mean, they always say there's a certain amount of percentage of our ocean that has not been discovered yet. And everyone loves space, but like I told you off air, I love the ocean. I think there's hidden mysteries to it. I think there's things down there that we probably haven't came in contact with. I mean, Dino Fish was like a documentary I saw on Netflix that talked about, I think it was the Coelacanth. I'm probably saying that name wrong, but it's a 60 million year old fish that they found at the bottom of the ocean floor. And they started talking about how, time moves differently down there because the distortion of there's no sunlight or where sun can't get to it. And I'm just like, all right, I'm hooked. Ancient fish in the bottom of the ocean. I'm interested because there's that theory that there's an octopus that comes from space. I'm not going to sit here and jump corners with you, but I'm also looking at the fact of when you really examine what we know about this earth compared to what we don't know, there's a large amount that we don't know. And I really wish that more public interest would be into our oceans, would be more into the earth as well too, coming outside from a geology, I guess, exclusive background. There's a lot of people that just love the space topic because it's interesting to think that there's other beings out there. But I think you probably have seen some secrets in our ocean floor that could tell you that the alien is really here on this earth, and that is the ocean. The ocean is something foreign to a lot of people.
Yeah, that's you've just opened up so many cool topics there. In a way, the aliens are among us because what lives beneath the ocean floor lives in the world around us. And I'm going to tell you and our listeners a little bit about how I got into studying life beneath the seafloor, and that'll give you a sense to how weird it is. When I was earlier in my career, I did research on what the oceans and the climate used to be like. And I did that by taking samples of marine sediment. We'd core deep beneath the seafloor, and we'd take out samples of marine sediment, and we would treat those as an archive of Earth history. So we'd use the chemistry of the sediment and the chemistry of the fossils in the sediment to learn what the oceans were like. And we would use the nature of the sediment to learn what the oceans and climate were like. And as I did that research, I realized something that many people realize, which is that the records are always a little bit altered, right? What we see isn't a perfect recorder of what the oceans and climates used to be like. And I got to thinking about why is that record imperfect? And the reason that record's imperfect is because that sediment isn't just like a mausoleum of, from past oceans. It's also a living ecosystem. And the organisms that live in that sediment are slowly changing the records of the world before them. So by their breathing, for example, the microbes that live in the sediment change the chemistry of the sediment that they live in. And I thought, this is kind of different. This is this ecosystem. It's really a biome. It's a global ecosystem that I didn't know anything about, and that basically almost no one knew anything about. And I hadn't been thinking about it because I thought of sediment as like the deposit of past ages. But it's the deposit of past ages, and it's also part of the living world. And the organisms that inhabit that sediment are descended from organisms that were once in the world around us. And that's why I said, in a sense, the aliens are also among us.
Kind of like anthropologists and archaeologists will talk about ancient DNA, like it's like a mixing pot of what we are now. But these things are literally living ancestors in a sense, just because their environment is completely different. See, it's going to bring me down this weird rabbit hole. I hope it doesn't get weird for you, but it's got weird for me already. When it comes to these organisms that are inhabiting deep parts of the ocean that a lot of people aren't ever going to be able to come in contact with, is this possible to be able to see like an environmental change that they are involved in so drastically compared to like we change our environment up here? Like if it's 10 degrees one day and then it's 40 degrees the next. Now that's pretty obvious for us, but for something like them, their whole ecosystem is constantly being kind of thrown in a spiral in a sense. I mean, depending on if we talk about an oil spill, if we talk about different challenges that we do to our earth, there are impacts that we don't see because we notice what affects us, but we don't notice what affects them. And for them, maybe being so small, you'd have to look at them with a microscope. We don't really notice the change that we're doing in a sense. And I'm wondering, do they have very good adaptive methods to be able to evolve or be able to adapt to their climate that they're in? And if we look at a record of, let's say, 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago, 200 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago, would you be able to notice a drastic change in their, I guess, whole entire aspects of what they are compared to now? I feel like just with how fluctuating our oceans are, and especially if it's deep down, it's hard to kind of make an impact down there. We notice what comes up at the top, but I start thinking in my head when I work jet skis, whenever you'd spill oil into the water, you put soap on top of it and it drops right down to the bottom immediately. I go, now, if there's certain chemicals that can be spilled into the ocean and it drops down immediately because of a method we use to cover it up, what does that do to those things down there? Because honestly, I think they might be a link to a lot of our problems, not our human problems, but microplastics. I mean, certain cases where you could use bacteria to eat up microplastics, that might be a far-fetched idea, but how would we know if it's that far-fetched if we don't ever look into it?
Yeah, I mean, you're raising a host of really cool questions. I'm going to start by saying that the stuff that I look at that's deep beneath the seafloor, say meters to hundreds of meters beneath the seafloor, and other people look kilometers beneath the seafloor, we're eventually going to affect that stuff, but probably not real soon because it takes a while for signals to work their way through the sediment, right, in the water. But the stuff that's living on the seafloor, we can affect that immediately, just like you said with your jet ski example. So like when that oil well blew up in the Gulf of Mexico, right? And there was oil everywhere. And then they dropped detergent. You know, they call it a surfactant, but I'm sure as you know, that's a detergent. They just dropped the detergent in it to essentially encapsulate that oil and sink it out. And it swept through the water, and it probably changed the communities in the water everywhere that it swept through. There's a study published recently by a woman named Layla Hamden and her students who work along the Gulf Coast. And they showed that the microbial communities at the seafloor around shipwrecks are different than the communities farther from the shipwrecks, right? So when you're 10 meters from a shipwreck or 50 meters from a shipwreck, you have a different community than when you're a kilometer from a shipwreck. And so even things like that we think of as like, shipwrecks don't move, right? You drop them, they land wherever they land, and yet they somehow still affect the community, tens of meters away. And then you take an example like you gave where you coat oil with a surfactant and drop it. Everything that sweeps through, it's going to change. I mean, detergent is really good at killing microbes, and it's really good at killing larval swordfish.
Now, with a certain community that's changed, do you ever notice a certain climate or maybe a part of the ecosystem down there that where a microbe is dead? Does that affect the whole environment to a point where you don't see anything, or are they really, really adaptable and very, very hard to completely eliminate? Because even if you're talking about the communities being different, I can understand that because of metals and other factors in that area that would probably add on or change their climate that would cause them to make drastic change. But I wonder what happens when you eliminate it completely. Would you notice a drastic change in that ecosystem? Would it be something like if all trees just disappeared? People go, well, I live in a city. I don't see really trees anyway. I don't care about nature. I'm like, yeah, but you would notice the air getting a little bit thinner. And I think that's the same thing with these microbes. Like I was talking to a guy who talked about quantum biology and talking about all these inner working things. The especially you can notice a lot about it in plants as well too. I kind of look at it like this: when you take one factor out of an environment, you don't notice the impact that that thing had until it's gone. And then once that thing is gone, you don't know. Like we don't know what would happen if every microbe in the ocean died, and it would probably be, I mean, a drastic event that would kill all life if it was going to kill those as well too. But I start wondering, especially when it comes to climate change, when it comes to environmental influences, a lot of people are looking to hydropower to be able to help out in a sense. And I go, maybe that's a possibility as well too. But I want to find a sustainable way to make sure that we're not hurting anything, even if it's this small, even if you have to use a microscope to see it, because everything is running the way it's running, and people can have judgments on, oh, it's not running that well, so a big change wouldn't be a bad thing. Yeah, but you can also mess it up, man. Like you don't like that's the thing is the unknown part. It's like that's the scary part to me is noticing if we do one thing that has a drastic impact on this and that thing goes away, what else is going to change? Are our oceans going to stop fluctuating the way that we've been seeing it fluctuate? Is it going to get better? Is it going to get worse? Are you willing to take that risk? And a lot of people don't ask these questions, and I feel like they're very important.
So I want to follow up. I want to tie together a couple of things that you touched on. The first thing is that
I'm sorry I ran a
in,
lot.
no, that's okay. The in some ways the deep ocean is a fairly stable environment, right? It takes decades for it to begin to warm up once the surface starts warming. So it's kind of slow to react, but it does eventually react. And so I'm going to give two examples of how we're in the process of changing or about to change the life on the seafloor for probably tens of millions of years. Okay, so the first example is related to the rare earth metals that they're interested in using for things like windmills and solar panels and stuff. And I don't want this to be viewed as an argument against moving toward electrification, but I want people to think deeply about where we get the materials for that, because there's a big push now internationally to mine the seafloor and to go out there and scrape off the top of the seafloor these nodules. They're like cannonballs that grow where the sediment accumulates really, really slowly. And those cannonballs have been growing for millions of years as metal just precipitates out from the seawater and from the sediment onto a nucleus, which can be a shark's tooth or a fish bone. Okay, and then organisms live on those nodules and on the crust that forms when the nodules coalesce together. And so you'll have sea stars and hydroids and anemones and stuff that's not real charismatic, but that populates the seafloor, living on that hard ground. And then beneath that hard ground, you just have soft mud. So people are saying, well, okay, we're just going to go out there and in, say, 5-6 kilometers of water, we're just going to vacuum up these little cannonballs and we're going to use them to build electrical stuff and everything will be fine. But when they vacuum that stuff up, they're taking away something that took millions of years to grow, tens of millions of years in many cases. And so essentially, once it's gone, they're changing the seafloor to being just a muddy wasteland for tens of millions of years before us. Like maybe it'll change that seafloor until the crust actually subducts back into the mantle, 30, 40 million years from now. And by changing the seafloor, they change the ecosystem. They change the animals that can live on it, because stuff that can live on a hard ground, and move around on a hard surface can't move around on mud. And nobody really thinks about these things very much. But, there is a group of scientists who are concerned about mining of mid-ocean ridge vents, which is another whole ecosystem, more like the kind of place where in movies you see octopoid aliens, around hydrothermal vents. So you've got hydrothermal vents, you've got all these metals that are being precipitated out. And then on the cold seafloor, you've got all these metals precipitating out slowly in cold water. And once we start strip mining that, we can take it away in probably a couple of decades. And then we're going to change the seafloor and the life in the ocean for tens of millions of years. I don't know if it's worth that couple of decades or not.
That's what I guess scares me a little bit. I mean, a lot of things. I say nothing ever scares me, but a lot of things honestly do. The way I use it as an example or just a word to toss out, it's the fact that this thing took this much amount of time that we're at now, and then now we're noticing, hey, this could be a thing that we could use. It's like, yeah, but for how long? And they say, well, a couple generations, maybe. It's like, okay, a couple generations, but what happens is when that's gone, what's going to happen after that? Are you looking at the long lasting impacts? And a lot of people, as long as it doesn't mess with whatever they're working on, they're more than happy to push it onto something else. And I think this is where I found you and I wanted to reach out to you, was because I was getting interested in the climate topic, and I was talking to a lot of people from renewable energies. And then I guess I came across you from hydro or some type of water thing. But I think I get down some really weird rabbit holes when I'm reaching out to people, and it probably linked me down to where you're at. And I started wondering, I was like, what about the microplastics? What about all these other things that people are talking about that are issues? People go, mine this, mine that. Well, what's the damage of it? And I think the only way you can really kind of get the topic out there for people to get interested in is either if it's affecting their life or it's something that's very sexy. And sadly, the thing that's very sexy is something that is aliens. It is something that is out there. And I've noticed that from talking to so many people that are in it. So, I mean, I'm just curious, what research wise or anything that you've discovered in your work that you can be able to tell me that maybe are some points that people need to keep into their mind when they start kind of tossing out ideas about mining, or when they talk about ideas that come to the concept of just using our ocean. I wouldn't say even really pushing it to its limits. I would just saying pushing it to a cataclysmic point or a catalyst point. I don't think our oceans are going to beat us out 10 times out of 10. Um, but I just think that we're not paying attention to the damage that we're doing, because even though people say by 2100 the ocean level is going to rise like 6 feet, it's like, yeah, okay, human race might be in danger, but does that mean we have to sacrifice our own kind of generational thing to another generational thing that we don't even get to notice? And I think that brings us into some weird territory. Yeah.
So I want to follow up on that by talking directly about climate in a way that people don't usually
Real
talk
quick,
about it.
this headphone piece,
Yeah.
it's scratching on your shirt.
Ah,
Good.
okay.
All right.
Yeah, I should have worn a t-shirt.
You're good.
So I want to talk about something that people sometimes think about, don't often talk about. And it's because when I was studying climate, I was looking at really long time scales, like how climate changed from ice age to interglacial, for example. If you warm water, it holds less gas, right? Like a cold can of soda holds more CO2 than a warm can of soda, right? It goes flat. And the same is true of the gas that dissolves from the air into the ocean. So everything that's in the ocean breathing oxygen is breathing oxygen that dissolved into it at the relatively cold temperatures where deep water is formed by chilling in like the Southern Ocean or the Arctic, or the North Atlantic. So that's pretty cold water, and it goes down with a relatively large amount of oxygen. But as we warm Earth and warm the surface ocean, we're going to warm deep water. We're gonna make those zones where deep water forms warmer and warmer and warmer. And if you can raise deep water like 5 or 10 degrees Celsius, which is, my arithmetic's not real good with this in this sense, but we're looking at maybe 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's been that warm, like it was that warm during the age of dinosaurs. It was that warm early in the age of mammals. So we can get it there with a little effort, I think. If we do that, it's going to hold a lot less oxygen. In fact, it will hold so much less oxygen that pretty much all of the deep Pacific will be without oxygen. It will literally be anoxic. And under those conditions, the microbial communities and the animal communities of the entire deep and midwater ocean, for like 60% of the world ocean, are going to be fundamentally different, because fish can't live in anoxic water. They can't live without oxygen. Squid can live on low oxygen for a while sometimes, but they can't live without oxygen. And the microbes that live without oxygen are very different than the microbes that live with oxygen. So if we run this warm up out to a point where it's been, say, a few tens of millions of years ago, the ocean microbial communities will be fundamentally different. And the ability of the ocean to essentially take up, the ability of organisms to respire in the ocean is going to be fundamentally different. And the chemicals that the microbes use to respire are going to be fundamentally different. They're going to have to use sulfate, which is an oxidized sulfur, instead of oxygen. And so it's going to change the cycling of oxygen and carbon in the world around us in a very fundamental way. And that'll all be due to just that warming.
Now, here's like kind of a hypothetical, but if there is sea mining or if there is some type of oil spill or something like that, is it possible to shift the oxygen level in the deep part of the ocean to make it, I guess, the higher up you go, there's a little bit more oxygen? Like I start looking at like the amount of oil that's dropped in a certain area. If you have sunlight that's going through the water and heating up the water, and that oil expands or some type of chemical reaction happens that causes it to become less O2 down there, that causes the things that are deep down in the water to want to rise up to where there's normal levels of oxygen, what they were used to. And I start wondering, is that, I mean, people would use that as like, well, that's a great way to discover what's down there. I go, yeah, you don't want that though, because there's some things you don't want at a higher level. You're talking about people have issues when sharks come into shallow water. Imagine something that you'll see one of those lanternfish that everyone gets scared about come a little bit higher up. I mean, I start seeing a whole time, I guess, climate shift, not when it comes to the climate of the air around us right now. I'm talking about deep in the biome of the water. You're going to see a whole shift. And I start wondering what that could be. I mean, you're going to have fish that aren't supposed to be that high up, that can't handle light, for instance, that are basically just committing suicide in a sense when they get up to the surface just to get a little bit of oxygen.
We see that happen actually here in Rhode Island. And what I mean by that is that in the hot days of typically August, Narragansett Bay gets a lot warmer and the water holds less oxygen. So it's like a little microscopic version. Well, I shouldn't say microscopic, but it's like a small bay-sized version of what I was talking about for the ocean as a whole. And so on those hot days, there's not enough oxygen in the deeper water, which is just a few meters to a few tens of meters down, to support the fish in the bay. And so they swim toward the surface just as you're describing, right? They're swimming to stay up in oxygenated water. But that the low oxygen event, they're called low oxygen events, which occur in the various harbors and bays around Narragansett Bay and occur in other parts of the other estuaries of the world. That low oxygen water gets all the way to the surface at some point, right? Because as you concentrate those fish, they keep breathing more and more and more of a smaller and smaller amount of oxygen, and then it's all gone. And then we get a fish kill. And then people are like, oh my God, what's that smell? And then they look out at the bay and then they see like thousands of dead fish on the shore. Right. And this happens with some frequency. It happens every few years here in Narragansett Bay. And it's driven by the same sort of process you're talking about. Once we destabilize the system that much, there's going to be a lot of dead animals along the way.
Yeah, well, we noticed in Venice when the pandemic was going on, when it first started, was that they saw dolphins swimming in there again, and the water started to return back to color. I mean, I don't think people when we talk about like a human impact or something like that, nobody really thought that it was going to be that fast that you would see a turnaround. And I start going, yeah, if you really don't affect an ecosystem as much, you really start to notice that when it starts to kind of naturally have its own process that comes back. But the issue is that we haven't affected it to a point where there is no coming back. And that's where we're kind of heading towards when we start talking about ideas of mining or all these other concepts up there as well, too. I think an interesting kind of road to go down would be if we talk about mutagens with these microbes or these types of animals that are down there as well too. You're telling me that if I drop castor oil or anything of that whatever sort you want to put into the ocean, that's not going to affect animals. People think like that. And it's like it's going to affect something. But what is that going to do? And is it going to be bad, and how bad is it going to be? These are the questions that come to my mind when I see an oil spill on TV. People go, "Oh, that it's terrible for the environment." It's like, yeah, but when you're saying it's terrible for the environment, are you just signaling to your tribe of environmental people like I care about it, or are you actually worried about what that's going to cause? Because I have 10, 15 questions that follow when I see that news headline.
So yeah, I think you're opening up a really. I'm going to talk about something you mentioned, castor oil, and I'm going to use some jargon that organic environmental chemists use. Persistent organic pollutants. They use the phrase persistent organic pollutant, and then they'll say POP. And so when you wander into a bunch of organic chemists, they're all talking about POPs. But the important thing to remember is that persistent organic pollutants are just chemicals that are not easily degraded, right? And they're all around us. And I'll give some examples. Caffeine, right? I've got a cup of coffee in front of me. It's got caffeine in it. I drink that coffee. Most of that caffeine is going to go through me and into the Providence not water system, but sewage system, and then it's going to go out into the environment somehow. So caffeine is a persistent organic pollutant. Triclosan, which was really common in soap back in the 90s, was invented to kill bacteria, and it's a persistent organic pollutant. And you can actually go into say the Puget Sound, and you can trace the flow of water out of the sound by just following the concentrations of caffeine. Or you can go into Narragansett Bay, and you can go all throughout the bay, and you can measure triclosan. And it turns out you can measure other persistent organic pollutants are like fire retardants, the weird chemicals that come out of the plastic water bottles that we drink out of that people worry about carcinogens.
Phthalates.
Yeah, phthalates. So anyone, I don't know, there's like 10,000 synthetic industrial chemicals, right? And they've only looked at the health effects of a few hundred of them. And most of those chemicals are persistent organic pollutants. And you can measure them in seawater off Antarctica. That's how well they persist. They get into the ocean, they mix around, and then before you know it, you're off Antarctica measuring persistent organic pollutants. You can pull fish out of the deepest parts of the ocean, say 8 kilometers down, or you can pull other isopods, which are kind of like pill bugs, only these are bigger and they live in 11 kilometers of water. So you can pull isopods out of the deepest part of the ocean, and you can measure persistent organic pollutants in their guts. So that stuff goes everywhere, even places that visually look undisturbed by people. We're pumping chemicals into those environments, and some of those chemicals are known to cause cancer. So they're the mutagens you're talking about. There's a really cool, to me, cool article about 2 months ago in the news where these researchers dropped a robot beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, and then for thousands of I don't know what it was, for at least hundreds of kilometers, they had beds of ice fish. Like the ice fish had dug out little saucers in the ground, and then they were protecting their eggs. And so as far as the robots could see in all directions, they had ice fish. And they're like, this is the least disturbed ecosystem on Earth, was their punchline. And my immediate response when I saw that was, wow, bet there's persistent organic pollutants there. Because the water that comes under the ice is coming from the ocean, and it's carrying our mutagens with it.
Yeah, see, that's what gets me is that we can't traffic control even fish, for instance. What happens if a fish is in a certain area where there's a pollutant, and next thing you know, they drag it to a whole other part of the ecosystem, and the next thing you know, that whole area gets infected. There was an article that came out recently about they found $150 million worth of damages of nuclear waste that was being dumped into the waters of this town. And it was like a small reporter that was able to expose it. I don't know if you came across that. I totally forgot the name of the lady that did it. I was trying to get her on the show to talk about it, but this is real stuff that's going on. Companies aren't being held for their cases of pollutants. We're not paying attention to those types of things. Also, when it comes to, there was an article that came out, not even, I think around the time I first reached out to you, I know it was like a couple of months ago, but it was about a shark that reproduced without a mate.
Yeah.
What is that? I know people are like, look how cool this is. I'm like, hang on, that's something that's going on in the ecosystem around it that's causing it to be forced to that point. I'm not wrong in saying that. Like, that gave me a little bit of fear in a sense.
That's a strange story. There was another one about a week ago, actually, about a mouse that had babies without a mate.
Can I do it? Can I do it?
And I hate to tell you this, but I haven't checked you that closely, but so far all of the animals that can do that are female, right? So somehow they managed to create a microscopic, I shouldn't say a microscopic, but a little version of themselves. And so instead of having needing to fertilize an egg, they create an egg that doesn't need fertilization. And then before you know it, you've got baby mice that are identical to their mother, or baby sharks that are identical to their mother.
Now, a lot of people look at that in a positive light, but my only question that I start to think of is, does that eliminate the males, or does that cause males I don't want to reference what Alex Jones said, but Alex Jones talked about the frogs, they're turning the frogs gay. Now, if that was because frogs' genders were changing on the environment that they were being consumed in, and also a base of chemicals that were involved in it as well too. If you have a bunch of sharks that are females able to reproduce without having a mate, does that eliminate male sharks?
Well, so that's a good question. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is that there are lineages, and a lineage is just like an ancestor and its descendants, right? So I come from a lineage of Dants who are from somewhere in Western Belgium back in the day. So there are lineages of lizards that there are no males, right? Because the females are fully parthenogenic, and they're called parthenogenic. It's just a reference to basically Athena springing from the forehead of Zeus back in the day. So actually the example doesn't follow the biology, right? Because she sprang from Zeus, not from Hera. But we'll set that aside. So like around in Arizona, there are lineages of lizards that are fully female, right? The mother and all of the descendants are female. And then they've got cousins that reproduce in the standard way. And so those lineages have males. But the ones that are fully female, there's no need for males. There aren't any males. I don't know Alex Jones, and I've never talked to him. My thought is, I'm okay with these lizards just having females,
Yeah.
And I want to separate that from the damage that we're doing to frogs and lizards and people, right? If something occurs in the world, if a female mouse develops the trick of having female mice, good for her. If a female shark develops the trick of having baby sharks once in a while without a male, good for her. But I do want to separate that from the tremendous damage that we're doing with these mutagens to frogs and people and fish and everything else.
Well, that's what I'm leading to, is that imagine a species having to adapt its genetics to be able to reproduce on its own because maybe a lack of males that are in the area. Then you start looking at the goalpost moving. So why would they ever need males again? So they would just make sure that that egg would only have females, only because that's all it can really grow. The certain amount of chromosomes are only linked to that GNA. Now, if we look at mutagens, for instance, what happens when we open up that door for, oh, this fish, it can glow in the dark. That's a cool new adaptive trait. Oh, guess what happens? Now they all glow in the dark, and there is no going back because that gene has now been altered and there's no point. Kind of like humans evolving. We evolve and certain traits drop off and certain traits get gained in a sense as well too. But there's no going back to that. See, as you keep moving the goalpost or this, it might sound cool. Oh, cool. Sharks can reproduce by themselves. I'm not super worried about that, but what I do see is the eventual timeline that starts to happen where you start seeing other traits get let in, that people see the positives in it, but you don't see the fact that there's no going back to the original. Once you lose your arm, it's gone. You can get a robotic implant or you could do whatever that sense, but you can't grow your human arm back as far as we know human capability wise naturally.
I want to agree with you and sort of amplify that and just continue a distinction also, which is that if something in the world evolves some character, that it's just natural result of evolution and we didn't induce it, I'm kind of like, that's fine. That's part of the world, right? But and that would be true for lizards that have, identical babies, for example. But we are deliberately changing the world in ways that you've touched on here. Like you talked about glow in the dark fish, right? This, essentially they've taken a gene from a bacterium that glows, and they've put it into, they meaning various genetic scientists, have put that gene into other organisms. And then you get glow in the dark fighting fish, or you get glow in the dark kittens. Both of those things have been created. Glow in the dark kittens are very, very uncommon. But, I don't know, is that really something we need to be doing with our time? And then if you take it on a bigger scale, you think of like corn, Roundup resistant corn, right? First, they develop a persistent organic pollutant, Roundup, which has this advantage that it kills most of the weeds in a field. And it's got these disadvantages, like, well, it's a carcinogen and a mutagen for frogs and lizards and everything else, everything else that comes into contact with it. And then they create corn that is resistant to Roundup by inserting a gene into it. Okay, and I mean, you talk about your rabbit holes, right? Here we start out with a noble cause. We want to grow corn without weeds. So then we create something that just pollutes the earth and causes cancer and just about everything. And then we genetically manipulate corn so it's resistant to this pollutant. But corn, you probably know how corn reproduces, right? It's got wind-blown pollen.
Yeah.
So the wind-blown pollen from this Roundup-resistant corn gets out into all the cornfields of all the world. And then every farmer is growing Roundup-resistant corn, whether they want to or not. And then, as long as I'm going to follow down this rabbit hole,
Well,
Monsanto can follow up by then suing all those farmers for having Roundup-resistant corn that they don't even want.
Bartow Elmore, right?
No.
He was the guy who wrote Seed Money, who talked about this exclusively on Joe Rogan. He wrote a book about it. He was on the show talking about it and how this crop, and people don't realize this. See, people don't care until it affects their food. Once it affects their food, they start to take a stand. And here's where we can relate to the ocean, for instance. Fish. How much fish, salmon, tilapia? There was a whole tilapia poisoning thing in my town where you couldn't buy tilapia because there's a certain metal or chemical that was in the water that happened where they pulled the tilapia out from. Like, people don't realize sooner or later you're going to get to a point where when you're cutting into whatever you're going to eat, whether it comes from the fish, whether it comes from the sea, if you didn't grow it yourself, and even then there's some sketchy lines where we can talk about, is it still polluted or something like that? You're going to be eating contaminated food. That's going to cause humans to have to adapt to the food that they're consuming. So out of all the list of health effects that they're probably going to come with it, your body's going to adapt to something where you're never going to see the original come back. Even now, we have a certain amount of plastic in our blood right now. Like, that's what's insane, is that people don't realize these things. And it starts with something like an oil spill. It starts with something that keeps going farther and farther down the line, where you start wondering why people like my age are in their 20s having digestive disease disorders. I have my own. And once I started knowing more about it, people all my age were like, oh, I have that too. It's like, that's in our food. What do you drink? They're like, milk. I'm like, staying away from milk forever. What is it specifically though? Almond milk? They're like, almond milk. I'm like, that's not natural. Like, what's wrong with you?
Yeah, I'm not a food expert, but I mean, there's I think about these things, like, everyone in America at this point knows you shouldn't eat tuna more than a couple of times a week.
I got mercury poisoning, I know.
Or swordfish or whatever. And that's an example, right? We've been pumping mercury into the world, and the persistent organic pollutants are they're very similar to mercury in the sense that, organisms low in the food chain eat them or take it in, and then other stuff eats that and concentrates it in their internal organisms, and then other stuff eats the other stuff. And so when you get to the top of almost the top of a food chain, like a swordfish or a tuna, they're not quite at the top because we eat them, right? You've got a lot of concentrated pollutant. And then whatever eats that concentrated pollutant, which is people eating canned tuna, gets a bigger dose of it.
Yeah, I eat
and then we concentrate it.
I ate a canned tuna a day. My doctor was like, you have mercury poisoning. I was like, well, what's the side effects of that? He's like, it's depression. I'm like, I already got that, bro. And he was like, hair falling out. I was like, all right, that's some stuff I got to worry about. It's just cheap. It's $1. But that's the thing, is that, like,
It's
If
also good.
I love it. I don't know why people complain about cans of tuna. It's delicious to me. Put it on a salad or something. But people talk about a lot when it comes to whenever a pandemic happens or whenever something of drastic cause that causes everyone to flock to the stores. You see all the perishable items like sugary cereals and the things that they warn you not to eat get taken off the shelves. Then it's the canned foods that are left. And they say canned foods, they last a long time. If an apocalypse or nuclear war ever happens, you have your canned foods. Okay, but now our canned foods are being affected as well too. It's very, very hard to people want to buy organic and eat organic. Even with organic stuff now, FDA has some really sketchy guidelines on things. And sometimes it's not even things that they're thinking about. If you're getting fish that has been farm raised or whatever this type of thing is, it's not your fault if a chemical gets dumped into the ocean nearby and the water trickles down and next thing you know your thing's infected. There was salmon that were having mutagens that they started finding out where they were something that was there was something about them that was completely different than their natural path when they would jump upstream or do whatever they have to do their mating ritual. There was just a different thing that was getting linked down into their offspring. I remember reading this a year ago, and this was all from a factor of pollutants. Now, I'm not trying to go and say humans are the worst things in the world. No. But when you talk about affecting your environment, the whole entire issue that we need to focus on is here that the cure for your safety isn't going to be the thing that you're also destroying at the same time. And I want to keep these in mind when it comes to a lot of these things as well too. And I started realizing more and more is that I needed to talk to more people like yourself involved in these fields who were come up and close with these types of things as well too, because it's very hard to kind of be interested in everything and then understand every perspective. If everyone's saying that water is the way to go energy wise, I had to find someone who works in the water to talk about why that could possibly be an issue. And also some other things that I'm not thinking of. I mean, we look at mutagens, for instance, that's a big factor when we look at the next 10 years. I mean, just with the issues of how involved we're getting in the oceans. And sadly, I think the way that people sell climate change is by saying by 2100 the ocean's going to be 6 feet higher than it was or any of this type of stuff. Well, now you're going to cause them to want to find a way to reduce the water so when that 2100 does come you don't have to worry about the ocean being higher up because we fix that. And I live in a beach town, so that's like my main concern.
So, yeah, you've got me thinking. You've got me thinking a host of things. The first thing I want to say is that although my principal area of study is life beneath the seafloor, I do other things. And so, a couple of colleagues and I have a paper coming out soon about how parts of just about every major coastal city in the world are sinking faster than sea levels rising. And the reason that the land is sinking in most of those places is due to local human activity. We pump water out of the ground. And then we use that water for drinking, for showering, for watering our lawns. And, it's like anything, right? You take water out of a sponge, the sponge shrinks. You take water out of the ground collapses a little bit. And so we're actually collapsing the ground in parts of pretty much every coastal city in the world faster than sea levels rising. And so that's one more thing to think about. Okay, maybe we shouldn't be pumping so much water out of the ground. Um, and this sort of leads back to the other issue I was going to make is everything we do has consequences. I mean, what you or I do as an individual doesn't have a whole lot of consequence because we're just one person and, we don't command nations or anything. But then you multiply us by hundreds of millions of people and then by 8 or 9 billion people. And then collectively people have a huge impact. So hydroelectric power has big impacts locally and regionally, but it has less impact globally, right? So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest where hydroelectric power is a really big deal. And my mother's father worked to build a lot of those dams with, of course, thousands of other people. And, I grew up thinking of that as very clean power, and I still think of it as very clean power, but it came at a cost. Right? The salmon runs up the Columbia River and the Snake River and all the tributaries stopped, right? Because the dams blocked it off. You could grow fruit and grass and wheat in high dry desert because you could irrigate it with that water. But that changed ecosystems, and So the point I'm trying to make about that hydroelectric power is that there were very, very clear trade-offs at the end of the day. We got energy that doesn't pollute the air. We got agricultural capabilities that changed those ecosystems from being high, dry desert to being orchards. And those are things that benefit people, but they were real changes, and they came at cost to the local ecosystem and the regional ecosystem, and they came at cost to other people, like the people who relied on the salmon that came up the rivers. You know, and I'm kind of rambling here, and I know you know this, right? And probably every one of your listeners knows this, but everything we do has effects, and we need to be mindful about that. We need to say, okay, fish farming gives us cheap protein sources that can feed lots of people less expensively, but it causes a lot of local pollution, where you do it. And, but you're not depleting wild fish stocks if you grow fish, right? So those are the trade-offs people have to make in their minds.
When we talk about your research, for instance, does it ever come into your mind about that you might have to start researching reducing risk to the microbes or any of the other types of factors that are going in the ocean? Does it ever come to that? Like, because instead of like, like, for instance, you went on a trip. When you go on this trip, are you thinking about what am I going to discover new? What am I going to learn and unlock about the ocean? Or now you starting to worry about how am I going to protect this? How am I going to make sure that this doesn't change so we can still be able to pull valuable original data out of it rather than data that we affected? My biggest example would be like the moon, for instance. A long time ago, people wanted to launch nukes at it to blow it up to show how powerful we were. And then one scientist was like, maybe we shouldn't do that because we haven't really researched the moon, and our original data would be lost at that point because we affected our environment. There's not really a spot in the ocean, depending on where you're really going, that hasn't already been affected in some sort. And I'm curious that are you coming to grips with the fact that the original data for you to be able to do research or work, are you going to be able to tell if it's original data or not? Or are you going to be able to show that this is the only original data we can get because it's already been impacted long before we got to it?
You're asking a really good question. And because I focus mainly on life beneath the seafloor, um, most of what I find and most of what my collaborators find has not really been affected by people, except in the moment of sampling, right? So like we're gonna drive cores into the sediment, or we're gonna drill into the sediment, and then we take microbes out of the middles of those cores, or we take chemicals out of the middle of those cores and measure their concentrations. So when we bring those cores back to the surface, some of the microbes within the cores probably die and don't recover, right? So what I'm trying to say is in the act of sampling, we change the ecosystem. But before we sample, it's mostly untouched by people because it's meters, tens of meters beneath the seafloor. But the interface, the seafloor itself is not untouched by people. And stuff that lives below, at one point, it's descended from stuff that lived at the seafloor, and then more sediment came down and buried it, right? So if you study what happens at the seafloor, it's really hard to find a place in the ocean that is really, truly untouched by people in every way. Because you've got microplastics falling everywhere, you've got persistent organic pollutants going everywhere. And then the thing that's most problematic in my mind is bottom trawling, like dragging nets over the seafloor to catch fish. And, there are parts of the Eastern US shelf, or Eastern North American shelf, that get dragged many times a year. Like they might drag a spot 20 or 30 or more times a year, like dragging for scallops, dragging for bottom fish. And on average, the coast is dragged a few times a year everywhere. Okay, and so, right, that's a coastal thing, meaning maybe out to 100 or 200 meters of water. But these days, they're actually bottom trawling as deep as, they're routinely bottom trawling as deep as 2 kilometers in some parts of the ocean. And they're bottom trawling as deep as 4 kilometers in parts of the Mediterranean. And it's like running a plow over the surface of the land, right? What I mean by that is where you've got rough terrain, the trawling smooths it out. And the trawling sends up sediment because you're dragging over the sediment. So if you take satellite photos of the Gulf Coast where shallow water goes out a long ways, You can see trails of mud behind the trawlers. You can see a half a mile or a mile of mud behind each fishing boat. They're like worm tracks, right? And so it's been calculated that we move as much sediment off the shelves every year through trawling as enters through rivers. Like we're so effective at moving stuff around that we've become a geologic force in relatively shallow parts of the ocean.
Okay.
Relatively shallow now going down to the average ocean depth of 4 kilometers. And when you trawl at one spot for fish, okay, now you got some empty ecosystem kind of, because you just stripped all the fish away, right? So the fish from nearby neighborhoods, they're like, whoa, new suburb. And they move in. And then you go through and you trawl them away. So you don't just remove the animals from the footprint of your trawl. If you come back again and again, you're removing the animals from many, many footprints because they keep migrating in. And so I'm kind of rambling here.
No, it's funny because I was gonna say maybe I'm an idiot, but probably not. I definitely am an idiot. But my example that came to my head was when a dentist takes the little scraper and plaques your teeth or scrapes the guck off of it. You're just exposing a different area. It's like they're shaving it down in a sense. They say they're cleaning it off, but it's also exposing it to get hit again. And when you talk about raking the oceans, for instance, the deeper and deeper you have to go, what organisms that are deep under that sediment are coming up and not able to survive in the condition that their environment has just now changed into? It's like if I took you from 90 degrees and I threw you in negative 20-degree weather, you're like, what the hell? You're not going to be able to function. And for a lot of people, that's death in a sense. So these are these organisms that have never been exposed to this. It's like if me and you just immediately went to Mars. We can't survive in that atmosphere. That's these creatures. They're not able to survive in that new climate that they just got thrown up in. And the ones that don't survive, they immediately gone like that, like a Thanos snap. And that's what I pictured when this rake comes through, is that it's ripping up those things. So we're not even thinking about it because we can't see it. Most of the time you're digging that deep down, yeah, it might have a camera or something, but you're not physically seeing these little creatures, these things that are microscopic, get tossed up into the another different part of their environment, and next thing you know, they're gone.
Yeah, so stuff that can't tolerate oxygen, and a surprising fraction of microbes can't tolerate oxygen. They get churned up into the oxygenated surface, and then they're going to die. But there's another aspect of it which is still a little more charismatic, meaning stuff that people can see, right? When you drag the seafloor for scallops or for flounder, you don't just catch scallops or flounder, right? You catch everything that's on the seafloor. So if it's an area where you have coral on the seafloor, you drag up the coral. If it's an area where you have starfish on the seafloor, and everywhere is starfish on the seafloor, you drag up the starfish. So those trawls drag up everything. And then the stuff that is being fished for gets picked out, and everything else just dies.
When you go and you look for these organisms or you look for these microbes and you're really doing, like, you're discovering what's deep under the ocean floor, are you seeing any interesting data being pulled out? Like, is it interesting in a point where it's interesting in a scientific way? Because I'm hoping it's not interesting in a way where people are going to use it to their advantage as a cure to fix the human race, because that's how people view a lot of things.
So I'm gonna bring this into outer space now, because I
Okay.
promised you we'd do that.
Octopus.
Okay.
Tell me
Octopus.
about
Well, I won't get to the octopus yet. But, pretty much everything in the universe is radioactive, right? So we've all got radioactive elements in us. You and I have potassium in us.
Don't tell me that. I want to run like Superman thinking I got radioactive powers and stuff.
Yeah,
like
so
that.
you've got radioactive potassium in you. We've got teeny tiny amounts of your radioactive uranium and thorium and other random stuff in us. And when radioactive decay occurs, like energy is emitted. So it's like they're like alpha particles, which are actually little particles, are emitted during decay of uranium, thorium, a lot of other things. Gamma radiation is emitted by decay of potassium and by a lot of other decays. And when that radiation or those particles strike water, they break it. And when radiation kills people, it's mostly not the actual effect of the radiation. It's the damage of all of the oxidized radicals that are created by the breaking of the water in your body. So the radiation breaks water, that creates these oxidized radicals, and those oxidized radicals attack your body, and then boom. Okay. Well, so that's the downside of this. But the upside of radioactive splitting of water, if you're a microbe, is that there are microbes that can make a living by taking hydrogen and oxygen and making water from them and getting energy from making water. So if you have radiation breaking water, it generates hydrogen, it generates oxidants like oxygen and hydrogen peroxide, and then microbes can make a living taking that hydrogen and that oxygen or that hydrogen peroxide and making water again. And I think we have fairly good evidence that the main fuel for life in sediment that's older than a few million years is radioactive splitting of water. That microbes are taking the energy that's inherent in the hydrogen and the oxidants created by splitting the water, and they're harvesting that energy to live. So that means that in a sense they're independent of photosynthesis, right? They're set free of the photosynthetic world around us. And I think that's the case in all marine sediment older than a few million years, that they're mainly living off radioactive splitting of water. Now here's where octopus and other worlds come in. If microbes can live off radioactive splitting of water beneath the seafloor, then maybe they can live on radioactive splitting of water beneath the surface of Mars or beneath the ice of Europa, deep in the ocean of Europa.
Now, can this link to terraforming planets?
In a sense.
So I know
So
it's a
there's
long
this,
shot. It's a long
it's
shot
a
on that
long
one.
shot, but I'm glad you raised it. Generally, people think of like the rise of oxygen on Earth as due to the invention of photosynthesis, right? And that's the standard model that, once we had photosynthetic organisms, we could get lots of oxygen in our atmosphere. But the story is more complicated than that. And one of the complications is that for as long as we've had radioactive splitting of water, oxygen's been created on Earth long before photosynthesis, right? So in a sense, early terraforming of Earth itself probably relied in part on radioactive splitting of water. Because you split the water, you get hydrogen, some fraction of the hydrogen escapes to space, and some of the oxidants are left behind.
The radioactive water, for instance, or just the idea that terraforming a planet, exoplanets, the number has gone up drastically. Only because we're looking for planets that can inhabit human life. But imagine being able to make a planet into a habitable planet for human life. Now, that might take a very, very long time, but if you start the process now, that comes from being able to manipulate microbes. That becomes being able to do something with water. I think a lot of people really miss out on what creates oxygen. They go, trees, it's our oxygen provider. The ocean creates a large amount of oxygen for people. I live in a beach town, there's not really any trees around. So that's our main source of oxygen. Every time you step out the door, you get a nice of salt air. It smells amazing. But the issue starts to become is that I think that we're not going to have the science fully funneled out before we start doing these types of activities. And that's where the danger comes in. If people talk about we can find microbes on another planet and we can bring them here, you necessarily don't know if it's like that fish that gets torn up and thrown into a new environment and just vanishes because it's not able to handle light. You don't know what those microbes could do here. It could be insanely good or it could be insanely bad. Either way, you're displacing it from its original environment. And I think when we talk about the conditions that these microbes can go through, like in the beginning, people, at least in my mind, I start thinking of Mars, the conditions that Mars has gone through, being an arid wasteland or something like that. Well, if these things can survive in almost anything, then maybe they can survive on a planet that isn't capable for us, but maybe they could be capable for them. Then it's kind of like transferring blood. Like you don't transfer blood from an animal to a human. You don't do these types of things because we know the side effects and the bad things causing madness that happens with it. But they don't know about this because it's still new ground. So anything that's really hypothetical in this discussion is kind of open in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, you've got me thinking a whole bunch of things. One of the things I'm thinking is that the discovery of exoplanets, and I know, probably all of you listeners know, exoplanets are planets circling other suns, right? Circling other stars. And I just wanted to explain that for your few reviewers who might be coming into the thought. So to me, that's one of the really exciting scientific discoveries of our lifetime, right? The first exoplanet was discovered in like 1995 or 1996, depending on, how you want to count it. And I don't know, you probably know better than I do. Last time I looked, we were up to, many, many hundreds, and that was like 20 years ago. We must be up to thousands of them by now.
Yeah, we got a lot now.
And, it's this idea about life. There, 1,000 years ago, Thomas Aquinas had a debate with the Bishop of Paris about whether or not there could be life on other worlds. And Aquinas was like, how could there be? We are the most perfect. We were created in the image of God. And how could there be more than one us? And the Bishop of Paris's response was, who are you to put limits on God? Maybe God has multiple intelligent lives in his own or her own image. It was a very bizarre theological discussion.
Yeah.
But at that time, essentially you had one side arguing there are no exoplanets and there is no life elsewhere in the universe. And you had the other side arguing, how can you say there are limits? Right? There could be planets circling other worlds, going on forever. There can be life, intelligent life on other planets circling other worlds going on forever. And we're now sort of at a key threshold in the discovery of that, right? We've got the planets.
I don't think it'll be that long until someone reaches out to an oceanographer or someone studying the ocean floor like yourself to be able to talk about these types of concepts, because it's becoming a new forefront and a new avenue for people to look through. I mean, the alien debate always gets knocked down by religious people because they say if that means that there's aliens out there, there has to be a Jesus on every planet, and they can't fathom that concept of it. And I always bring up the thing back to Alex Jones. People are made in the image of God, but God doesn't know where God came from. So you have to ask the question, are we alone? And if we are alone, what does that mean? And if we aren't alone, what does that mean? There's always a bunch of questions that get asked. And I tell people, you don't have to look very, very far to find an alien. And an alien is actually in our oceans. There's a whole world where my example was a fisherman is basically like a space traveler, because what they're doing is casting a bobber into a water dimension where there's creatures that are intelligent as us in some sense. I mean, dolphins are always the example people use. They have different accents depending on what regions they come from. Like, this is a way to communicate. We don't understand. We only know that intelligence because it links closely to our intelligence, or in a sense is one that we can understand closely resembles somewhat of our intelligence. And people go, what about apes? Well, apes biologically are kind of more similar to us. But when it comes to human intelligence and the capabilities of learning, the fact that me and you can have a discussion about this is something that is pretty impactful. And I think it has people thinking a little bit more. That's why I'm always curious when it comes to the perspectives that people get from the job that they're involved in, because there's always something that links in like a little puzzle piece to the bigger picture. And I really honestly think that when people start spouting off things about living up in space and all these types of concepts, and it's interesting how someone had talked to you about this as well too, because I think the octopus thing is cool. I think it's a pretty interesting theory. I don't think it's true. I don't think at all. But I honestly think that that is interesting for a lot of people to get into, is that the fact that an octopus is like an alien. It's because it's something that we really can't explain. How can they fit through a keyhole? How can they do those types of things?
I mean, to me, yeah, I should feel more guilt over octopus because I sometimes eat them.
They're good.
But they're good. But, they're extraordinary. And when you look at their genetics, right, they're very clearly gastropods, right? They're related to snails and squid and clams. And yet they have evolved this wonderful visual system and this problem-solving ability, right? And it's just, there's, in a way, it's just a beautiful thing. That's something that is essentially, they're not real closely related to clams, just like we're not real closely related to lizards, right? But they're from a whole other branch of life, and they've evolved this intelligence. And and you referenced dolphins, which are obviously mammals and super smart. And then those are, I'm sure those are toothed whales, right?
Yeah.
But like we've also got baleen whales like humpbacks that behave in extraordinary ways. And people have killed millions of whales over the course of the 20th century, and so we've probably just rocked their culture in just awful ways. But these whales, as I'm sure they're like the dolphins. They have different accents. They have different songs in different parts of the ocean, and they pass their accents to each other. And humpback whales brawl with orcas, right? Like if orcas are preying on gray whales or on seals, humpbacks will come in like bouncers and start, slapping the orcas with their tails. The extent to which that's just anger or vengeance, because they also attack smaller humpbacks, I don't know. The extent to which it's altruism, I don't know. But the point is that they're behaving in a premeditated way, and they're behaving in an emotional way, right? They're saying, no, you're not going to eat any more seals today. And they'll travel for hundreds of kilometers to break up an orca feeding,
How does that
and I'm
not
just pulling that out
fascinate
of the
people?
air.
How does that not fascinate people? Like that already gets my mind just wandering. Like it goes back also to what I mentioned before about like microbes. If you really checked like what their trauma is or their ancestral line or trauma, whatever it has, I wonder how far back that goes. Because if you really talk about something that's lifespan is so, I guess are they don't live that long. They'd have to be really very short lifespans compared to humans, right? Depending on what we know about them.
Well, so you're asking the right person, because I have made the claim that microbes that live beneath the seafloor, they're like my grandfather's hammer, right? You keep
Awesome.
replacing the parts and call it the same thing. So I've replaced the head twice and the handle 3 times, but it's still my grandfather's hammer, you know? And
That's a good example.
these microbes, they're getting so little energy that when we calculate how much energy it takes to divide, they shouldn't be dividing, which means they shouldn't be multiplying. They shouldn't be giving birth to new microbes. But they're still there 100 million years out. So either they're living for 100 million years, just replacing body parts as they break, like my grandfather's hammer, or they're dividing on way less energy we think is possible for life to divide. But one way or another, we know they're living at least longer than any person, because we can measure the handedness of the amino acids in their body. So protein, as I'm sure you know, is made of amino acid. And amino acids can be either left-handed or right-handed. Organisms, to a first approximation, every amino acid in every body is made left-handed. But they're always vibrating. And so every so often they vibrate so hard that they snap handedness. The left-handed ones become right-handed, right-handed ones become left-handed. So we can use the ratio of right-handed to left-handed amino acids in your body to tell how old you are. But it doesn't tell us how old you are as a person. It tells us how old your body is. And your body's like my grandfather's hammer, right? The lenses of your eyes are, they go back to when you were first created. But most of the protein in your body is newer than that. The average protein's like 7 years old, maybe. So you and I are much older than the protein in our body. And we know that these bacteria beneath the seafloor, the protein in their body is between a few hundred and a few thousand years old. And if they're like us, they're living longer than the average age of the protein in their body. So they're living for at least a few hundred to a few thousand years. And if they're not dividing, they might be living for as much as 100 million years.
Is there any because I know you mentioned the other paper that you're working on that's coming out. Or is it out already?
The one on the sinking of the cities?
Yeah.
It was just accepted 2 weeks ago, so it'll come out soon.
When it comes to the area that you're starting to get interested more, not only just in your career field as well too, but just topics of interest. It seems like I've come across a lot of articles, maybe it's my algorithm, but a lot of work being done on stuff with the ice age and then also stuff with plastics and water as well too. Seems like there's being a more of a shift towards the interest in the oceans as well. I think that happens to do with the topic of climate change. I'm just curious, are you working on anything new in the upcoming future?
Um, that's another really good question, and I'm looking at ways I think about this. We've had this really strong focus in the earth science community on climate change for a few decades. I mean, and it's gotten more and more pronounced. And for a long time, it's worried me in a sense, but not. What I mean by that is, you've just alluded to this when you talked about shifting toward the oceans. We change the world in so many ways that climate is just the tip of the iceberg, literally. I mean, like, we're changing, as you've talked about with mutagens, we're changing the world, we're changing the oceans in myriad ways. And so one of the things that I've been pushing for in my semi-public personal professional life is greater recognition of all the ways we're changing the world. And so moving forward, I'll be looking probably some more at this issue of the sinking of the coastlines. I've done some work looking at acidification in estuaries and coastal environments, ocean acidification. But there's a community of course, many ocean scientists and earth and life scientists looking at these things, and I'm just one of a whole bunch of people looking at it. I
Stephen,
always look for new angles, though.
I appreciate the time you've given me. I'm gonna have you back on because what I want to do is I want you to send me some of the stuff that you can point me towards when it comes to looking at these types of issues and estuaries as well too. Just so I can do my own research and be able to sort out and have some better questions when it comes to this. Because I mean, I'm only doing like, I mean, this is like people think it's like you have to be a scientist to really find this information. You honestly can just look it up because it's a lot of people just aren't aware of it, and I wasn't aware of it until I started researching more and diving into one topic, leading me into another topic. And next thing you know, I'm studying something about water pollution or something like that. And it boils and gives me a bunch of articles about this. And it's happening, new accounts of it every single day that are being exposed, but you never see that on the media. You'll see an influencer that's lost for like 3 months that just comes out of nowhere, but you won't see something important like this because this is what it's going to boil down to. You talk about climate change, or you talk about we talk about the narrative being switched to that or something. It boils down farther than that. It starts, you need it to get to a point where it's caring about you're not human damage. I know people talk about like, I talked to a guy who's part of the voluntary human extinction movement, which is just don't have kids, let the population just die off. It'll save the planet. I mean, he's not wrong, but I honestly don't think that's try sales pitching that. It's not going to work. Um, but when it comes to a concept of, it's not about doing no damage, it's about reducing it to a point where it's very, very minuscule in the grand scale of how we've been doing it for so long. And we haven't really talked about that. It's always been about humans need to do no damage, no damage. It's like that's impossible because anything that you do in life causes a little footprint. So you need to understand about reducing your risk. And that's environmentally friendly stuff, obviously, but even some of those can go down some really dark rabbit holes as well, too. You need to do it effectively. And I think it just needs to come with education. And I honestly really I hate being the guy that says you need to toilet Google. But if that's where you're Googling, you need to do a little bit more of it and look in the right areas as well, too. And I think, especially, like I said, me inviting people to talk on my show as well, too, about the field that they work in, it gives you a better wholesome perspective. And I really look forward to our next chat.
I do too. Thank you very much.
Stephen, where can people find you before we go? Twitter, website, anything?
I'm basically not on social media, but I can be
Good for
found.
you.
I can be found on Google Scholar. I can be found on ResearchGate. And ResearchGate people can reach out to me, or you can find me actually at the University of Rhode Island. Just send me an email. My email's posted there.
I'll link your email, and I'll also link some of your profile websites on your Scholar and everything as well too. Appreciate you doing the podcast, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.